Hello everybody, Green Romantic here. It's a new year and it's a new me. So this year I started teaching a new class and I decided that I was going to make my class theme revolve around the Gothic. What is the Gothic? When I asked this question in class, nobody knew. Alright, so I'll tell you. If I give you some examples of what the Gothic is, can you figure it out? So one of my main examples is the novel Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. That was a romantic era novel and what people are heralding as the first science fiction novel, actually. Another example is the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker, which is one of the best-known vampire stories from the Victorian era. So what do these novels have in common? Is it the mood? Is it the themes? Is it the tropes? Or is it all of those things? Some of the things that I first learned about the Gothic were about the themes. So some of the themes of the Gothic are that it's supposed to be a critique of societal fears. And that is a theme that goes throughout all different types of Gothic. So the critique of societal fears uses a mood of gloom and terror and often invokes the supernatural and quite often also uses macabre violence and horror in order to get across its point. So when I was learning about the Gothic, I also learned about genre, which is in some ways about classification of information in order to be able to find things easier. So when you're looking at the Gothic genre, what you're looking at is different modes of classification. So for example, when you're looking at science fiction, you know that it has science and spaceships and aliens and that type of thing. So instead of science and spaceships and aliens, what kinds of things happen in the Gothic that you can use to classify it? So first of all, there are themes of light and dark in the Gothic, which might be physical, light versus dark, or it could be a metaphor for good versus evil, right versus wrong, something like that. Other tropes that appear are things like somehow being trapped, whether that be physically, socially, societally, etc. You can also have themes of excess, which is when you have too much of something. So you can have excessive appetite, excessive emotions, just excessive descriptions of things like that. You might also have different character tropes that you can figure out, such as the Gothic heroine is sort of over-the-top good. She's moralistic, she's beautiful, she's intelligent, she's moral, she's just somehow incredibly perfect. You might also have the Gothic villain, who is the opposite. It's usually a he, over-the-top villain, extremely evil, does things that have to do with excess, such as excessive evil things. You might have transgressions. So those can be transgressions of law, they can be transgressions of social order, those can be transgressions of nature or religion, all these types of things. For example, in Frankenstein, you have somebody who is transgressing law and morality by taking apart somebody's decomposing body and then sewing them back together. It's also transgression of nature because you have a person who is sort of playing God and reviving something and creating life in a way that is not right or moral. You might also have themes of the supernatural. So in the case of Dracula, you have vampires. There are a lot of Gothic novels about vampires, such as Carmilla and the Vampire, which are all sort of 18th or 19th century novels about vampires. But other things include ghosts, specters, monsters, demons, all sorts of different things that might not necessarily be real things. One of the big ones is a confusing landscape. So you might have underground passageways, you might have dark forests or oceans that you can't escape. Just a setting that is impossible to figure out the layout of. Last of all, you might have macabre violence or disturbing events. Some of these things might be things like people dying in weird ways, such as being buried alive, which relates back to the being trapped thing. You have in Frankenstein a guy cutting bodies apart and sewing them back together, which is kind of gross. You just have all these sort of disturbing things that you would think would never happen and somehow happen anyways. So what is the point of the Gothic? So when you're looking at the Gothic, you are again examining societal fears. So what about society at the time was the author trying to critique? What was happening? So you have to have sort of historical context in order to understand a lot of Gothic stories. Some of the things that people were afraid of were things like invasion, having foreign people coming into their land, being afraid of sickness, being afraid of mental illness. So there's a lot of different things that you might be afraid of. And some of those things can be tied back to today's society, in which people are afraid of things happening today like politics, global warming, those types of things. So ultimately, the Gothic is trying to tie together societal fears and critiquing things that happen in society. So when you're reading the Gothic, you should really keep that in mind, is that a lot of people who write this sort of stuff are trying to get across to the reader that there's something that society is afraid of, and it's critiquing that fear. So now that I've gone and told you about what the Gothic is, there are all sort of different types of subgenres of the Gothic. So you can have 18th century Gothic, or Romantic Gothic, Victorian Gothic, Postmodern Gothic. It all breaks up after that. It goes into things like Canadian Gothic or American Gothic. You can also break it up into things like gender and the Gothic, sexuality and the Gothic, and have all sorts of different things that you can critique. So fly, my pretties, fly and tell me about all the different kinds of Gothic thing that you have read. See you on the flip side.